Please welcome Professor P.Z. Myers.
Okay, wow, what a crowd. I was told I have to warn you of something, and that is that this talk has to end promptly at 5:45 because they're going to dismantle the rooms and they're going to throw you out. But that's not what's going to get you out of here anyway. 5:45 is when they start serving beer outside. Yes. So I kind of expect that no matter what I do, the audience is going to go poof right at 5:45. Okay, well, what I want to do today is I want to talk about a very common issue in dealing with intelligent design creationists. Their most common argument, basically their only argument. And I suspect that most of you have not attended one of their lectures. I have. Unfortunately, I've listened to Michael Behe and Dembski and John West and Stephen Meyer and all these people from the Discovery Institute that are cruising around giving their talks. And so what I thought I would do, since you probably haven't heard them all, is I would give you their lecture first. So I'm going to give you a condensed version of an intelligent design creationist lecture. It'll be very entertaining. Complexity, 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 complexity. Oh, look, there's a pathway. It's very complicated. Complexity, 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 complexity. And did you know that cells are really, really complicated? But we're not done. Complexity, 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 complexity. And you're going to be blown away by the bacterial flagellum. It's like a little machine, and it's really, really complicated. Complexity, complexity, complexity. Complexity. We need more cells. They're really complicated. You just get blown away by these things. They are so amazingly complicated. Complexity. Therefore, design. You've heard it all now. That's the root of their argument. Isn't that really complicated? Wow. How could that come to be? Well, let me summarize it a little bit more succinctly. The core of their argument is this, that complexity can only be created by design. That's the first premise they offer up. And then what they do in their lectures is they tell you over and over again, biology is really complex. And then that means biology was created by design. Now, I suspect there's a few philosophers out there in the audience. If you ever want to teach your students about the fallacy called begging the question, send them to the Discovery Institute webpage. That's what it is. This is a big exercise in circular logic in begging the question. So what I want to do here today is I want to address this premise. Complexity can only be created design. It's not true, first of all, and there's a couple reasons why it's not true. One is, first of all, the fact that they have to use a logically untenable argument to advance their case is kind of an argument against their story. The other thing is that what they are doing is they're reducing this whole complicated story. I use the word complicated. Oh, it is a complicated story. They're reducing it to an argument by metaphor. Metaphors are useful for getting across basic concepts to people, but they're not the foundation of a strong logical argument. And finally, I want to mention that what they're going to be doing when they make these arguments is they're going to be implying a lot of straw man claims about modern biology. And basically what they do is they parasitize actual research that's been done in the field. So let me push this a little further and talk about this metaphor. You know, you're used to seeing the Discovery Institute. And the Discovery Institute, as most of you may know, is very careful to remove themselves from any discussion of God. They don't want to get tangled up in that religion issue. And so they tend to put this secular front up in front of themselves, at least in their public pronouncements, though privately they mostly seem to be evangelical and fundamentalist Christians. But this argument can also be found somewhere else. Our favorite creationist, Ray Comfort, uses this same argument, this argument from design. This is from his book, You Can Lead an Atheist with Evidence, but You Can't Make Him Think. Typical Ray Comfort. And you can see the gist of his story here. He's saying that every building has a builder, every painting has a painter, therefore, everything has a creator. There's a problem with that argument, right? I hope you can see it. What this is simply arguing from an overextended metaphor, and it's the same thing that the Discovery Institute does when they show you a bacterial flagellum. So they're making this silly argument about buildings and painters and whatever strikes their fancy, and making this conclusion that every design has a designer. But my answer is then this must mean that every single thunderbolt must have a thunderer. You can't stop a runaway metaphor. There's no brakes on it. So we can just say anything we want. So this is, again, a logical fallacy. Making this kind of ridiculous argument for metaphor does not advance the cause in any scientific or rational sense. But it's the one they make over and over again. And it doesn't matter whether you're Ray Comfort or Michael Behe, they're doing exactly the same thing. Now, the other thing I have to point out here is their argument is fairly silly, and it's relying on biological evidence, right? Nobody would argue with them when they say biology is complicated. I teach biology. I flunk students every year. So I know that it's hard to get some of these concepts across to them. Unfortunately, what that means is that they're in an uncomfortable position. If they're saying that looking at all this complicated stuff necessarily implies design, why is it that all those biologists out there are doing this research, who are doing the actual research that they're stealing to present in their movies and their talks, why aren't they all following on this same conclusion? So what they have to do is they have to lie a little bit. And this is another one of those annoying things about creationists. They have to lie and say, well, we've only recently discovered how complicated this cell is. This is brand new. It's going to take a couple years, and once every biologist understands that cells are complicated, Darwinism will collapse. Dembski even said it was going to collapse within 5 years, 7 years ago. So here's the kind of thing they say. This is something that is very striking. Get on Google and search for Darwin protoplasm. And what you will find is nothing but intelligent design sites. They are all saying exactly the same thing. Like Tom Bethel here. In Darwin's day, the cell was thought to be little more than a simple lump of protoplasm, or containing a homogeneous transparent fluid. Jonathan Wells, who wrote the politically incorrect guide to Darwinism and intelligent design, which was actually mistitled. There was an error at the printers. It should have been the factually incorrect guide to Darwin and intelligent design, has said the same thing. Darwin thought cells were mere blobs of protoplasm. So it's part of their propaganda approach is let's make everybody else look as stupid as we are, and then maybe they'll be a little bit more gullible. And so first thing I want to do here is I want to show you that this is wrong. Darwin certainly had no such simplistic idea of the cell. You can dig back in the literature pretty easily, and Schneider, 1873, he's drawing cells up there. These are the first published illustrations of chromosomes. They knew about chromosomes in 1873. Fleming did a much better job. These are very nice pictures. All kinds of details of what's going on inside those cells. Nobody at that time had this idea that there was nothing in the cell but a homogeneous, clear solution. They knew that there was all kinds of interesting things going on there. There were people who were doing all kinds of exciting research. Camillo Golgi, Ramon Santiago y Cajal, all kinds of histologists were making names for themselves at this time by looking at cells and showing, hey, there's all kinds of cool stuff going on in here. We ought to watch it. And it wasn't as if Darwin was unaware of the literature. Okay, he died in 1882, so he may not have read Fleming's work, but he also published in 1882, and this is from Darwin's own work where he's publishing his studies in microscopy of plants. He's describing chloroplasts. He's describing how they move in the cell. He's looking at cytoplasmic streaming. So it's very, very silly to make this claim that Darwin thought cells were simple blobs. Okay, so they're relying on logical fallacies so far, and they're relying on lying about the history of science. What about this whole complexity issue, though? As I just said, we biologists will freely admit things are really, really complicated inside the cell. They're even more complicated when you have some training and understand the biology, unlike most of the creationists. So how do we explain that? Don't we have to resort to a creator? And we say, well, no, of course not. There's lots of things that are very complicated. I'll show you an example here. This is a photo from a beach up north, Rialto Beach in Washington State. It's one of my favorite places. I really recommend. Go ahead, take a vacation there. You'll love it. And this is a very common thing along beaches, even beaches in California. Driftwood. Have you ever looked at driftwood? You go on the beach, and I'm sure they bulldoze it away here, but you know, in other states, it's left sitting there. You find these walls of driftwood between you and getting down to the beach. Real walls, very complicated walls. Look at all those logs just lying all over the place. This is, we can say, a wall. It has been constructed. Who did it? We know the answer. Natural processes did it. We don't need a designer to build this kind of wall. That what happens here is this is just the storm line. That storms come along, they push logs that are floating at sea up onto the shore, and this is the limit of where they push them, and they pile up there, and they make these very complicated long walls that run for miles and miles and miles, and are interesting places with all kinds of bizarre things going on in them. I mean, these are habitats for various invertebrates, for birds, all kinds of things live in here. Bacteria, of course, are thriving on it, and you get these complicated shapes. This is complex. You simply can't deny it. That's a very complex thing. You know, if I turn the projector off, will you be able to draw it? No, because it's fairly detailed, all kinds of minutia involved in building this kind of wall. On the other hand, we're familiar with this kind of wall. So this is also a wall. It's one that we can recognize that has a specific purpose, that was built by human agents. And I'd have to say that of these two walls, which one is simpler? The human-built one. This is one of the things about agency, is that when we build things, we don't make them needlessly complex. We want to make them as simple and efficient as we can, unlike that driftwood wall. So there's a difference here. When we look at natural walls, what we discover is that natural things are built by chance and necessity. They're functionally unspecified. There's nothing that says that pile of driftwood is a wall. It just functions as a wall to us. But it's also got diverse other functions. And they all tend to be complex. In this sense, complex often means sloppy. But it's still complex. Artificial walls, on the other hand, are built with intent. They're functionally very specific. You know, you don't just get a bunch of bricks and some mortar and you randomly throw it around to build a wall. If you want to build a wall, you build a wall. And that makes them relatively simple. So this is a mistake they're making, is you can't use simple complexity as a measure of design. As another example, I know there are some academics here who are probably like me. You know, I start every school year and I go into my office and my desk is pristine and everything is neatly laid out. And if you want to see real complexity, come visit me around about December. And suddenly everything is overwhelmed with complexity. There's books and papers everywhere. And I swear to you, it's not by intent. I don't plan it that way. What it is a lack of planning that leads to this kind of complexity. Okay, what about real biology? Something more interesting than a pile of driftwood. Can we find instances of complexity building up in organisms, and can we say whether it's a result of design or something else going on? And I'm just going to give you one example because I don't want to be in the way of the beer. And this is one of my favorite animals. This is a choanoflagellate. Choanoflagellates are really cool, simple little protists. So that's the first thing I have to tell you. This is a protist. It means it is typically a single-celled animal. And what it does is it just sits there in the water column, and it's got this thing called a flagellum, which the creationists just love. Okay, well, there's a flagellum there, and it whips around, and what it does is generates vortexes of water currents that suck bacteria and other things that it might want to eat down toward that little collar of cells, or collar of cilia that surround the flagellum. That's how it lives. It just slurps up the water, collects all the bacteria that stick to its collar, and it thrives. It does very well. This is a protist, and like it says there, it's not a metazoan. And a metazoan is simply things like us, multicellular animals. I think you would all agree with me that there is a difference in complexity between a protist and a metazoan, right? Okay, because if you're going to disagree with me, I'd have to stop and we'd have to lecture for an hour to explain this. And that will get in the way of the beer, so I won't. So anyway, we're multicellular animals. What does that mean? That means we are made up of collections of cells, large collections of cells that have to do multiple things, messages back and forth, basically telling each other what they're supposed to do. So you can imagine, for instance, there are messages flying around when you eat a candy bar. Insulin, you've all heard of that. We've got to have this stuff that's flowing around that tells cells whether it's okay to take up sugars or not. It's part of the business of cooperation. We've got important signals going on during development. So during development, cells are sticking together, and then they're making decisions like, should I be a liver or should I be a kidney? And the way they have to do this is they talk to each other and they recruit their neighbors. And they say, okay, I'm going to be a liver. All my neighbors around you here, you're supposed to be livers too, liver cells too. So let's get together and cooperate and build an organ. And if any cell around there happens to want to switch on the kidney genes, we'll boot him out or tell him very strongly that he has to switch. But it requires communication. So we've got cell-cell communication going on all over the place. Now, these are functions that we think of as going on in us, all right? We're multicellular. What about choanoflagellates? They're single-celled. They don't have to do that stuff. They all have this free life just floating around independently, each cell doing its own thing. So you'd think, well, this is something new that has evolved in us. And here's a surprise. It's not new. That choanoflagellates have a lot of the machinery that are involved in this process. For instance, I'll mention just one example here. There's a protein that was thought to be characteristic of multicellular organisms, of multicellular animals, and that's a receptor tyrosine kinase. Makes you sound smart when you say these polysyllabic biological terms, doesn't it? Anyway, receptor tyrosine kinase, what it is basically it's a protein that sits on cell surfaces, and it binds to proteins in the neighborhood, so it's one of those communication agents. And then on the inside, it's got something called the tyrosine kinase, which sticks phosphate groups on other proteins and initiates a cascade of activity. So it's one of these cells that are involved in communication. It's getting signals from other cells, and it's telling the nucleus, telling the DNA what it's supposed to do. So this is what receives a signal, for instance, that, oh, my neighbors are all liver cells, so I'm going to activate these proteins, which will turn on liver genes, and we'll all be happy, and this will be a good neighborhood. We'll settle down and raise a family right here. So that's what this is for. Where did that come from, you might ask? Well, it turns out choanoflagellates have receptor tyrosine kinases. It kind of blew a few people's minds way back when, because receptor tyrosine kinases were thought just to be found in animals, multicellular animals. This is a characteristic of multicellular animals. Choanoflagellates are protists, they're not multicellular, yet they've got it. When they've analyzed this in some more detail, what they've discovered is an interesting history for this particular protein. How did you get this little protein? Well, if you look in plants and if you look in fungi, you find that they have tyrosine kinases, so they have the proteins that do that phosphorylation trick, and they're floating around inside the cell. And they have this other protein that sits on the surface called an epidermal growth factor. So it's a protein that's sitting on the surface and receives signals, but they're not tied together. And somewhere in the last common ancestor of choanoflagellates and us metazoans, there was an accident, a little glitch in the duplication of this gene, and it ended up fused. This is like peanut butter and chocolate, okay? Once upon a time, peanut butter and chocolate came together, and what you got was something new, a brand new protein that can do some interesting new things in communications between cells. So now cells can have this little receptor on the surface that can recognize their neighbors and can initiate a bunch of changes on the inside, and all these wonderful new features could then evolve. This is just one step in all the features that we evolved, but of course it arose in a single-celled protist. Okay, so those are receptor tyrosine kinases. Labs have now taken apart choanoflagellates. They've sequenced their genomes. They've pulled out all these interesting genes in there. And they found that there's a whole bunch of stuff that once upon a time we thought were unique only to multicellular animals. And there they are. They're inside choanoflagellates. So the receptor tyrosine kinase I just mentioned, and they're the ones that signal switches in gene activity. They also found cadherins. Cadherins are really useful in all of us. This is glue, okay? This is what, I mentioned that you have to have glue that holds your cells together. This is a special selective glue that you can tighten up or release by changing levels of calcium. So it makes development very flexible. And there it is. It's there in choanoflagellates. And they also have these things called integrins. Cells not only have to stick to other cells, but in us multicellular animals, we build complex internal environments. We secrete all kinds of proteins internally that make things like a cellular matrix, a protein matrix that cells can stick to. And they have special proteins dedicated to glomming on to these proteins and holding the whole structure together. And there they are in these protists. So the point is that we've got all this cool stuff going on inside. It's complicated, sure, but it's not as if a designer came along and said, well, we got to have multicellular animals, so we got to add all this machinery, all these tools, all these little fasteners and so forth to the genome so that they can stick together and build multicellular creatures. No, this was all stuff that was present earlier in single-celled animals. You might ask, what were the single-celled animals using it for? Well, it turns out that even if you're single-celled, it's useful to talk to your neighbors. You want to know what they're eating. Choanoflagellates exhibit interesting behavior where sometimes, for instance, they will clump together, and it's a more efficient way to get their flagella whirling away and draw in even more bacteria to eat. They also cooperate, they stick together when they go through diurnal cycles where they move up and down the water column. And again, what they do is they all pile together, they all aim their flagella in the same direction, and it acts like a little motorboat and shoots it up to the surface or down deep, whichever way they're going. So all these things are working together in single-celled animals. The lesson is that when we see this stuff, when we see complicated things, whether it's integrins, whether it's bacterial flagella, whatever, we make a mistake when we look at it as if nature is an engineer, as if somebody has designed those for a specific purpose. What we find is this, that evolved organisms exhibit complexity because they are a product of those processes. You'll notice I haven't talked about them. Again, beer in half an hour. What they are a product of is chance. So that's an important component. Let's just mix things up. The fact that an EGF and a tyrosine kinase once got together and fused, that initial event that fused those two genes together was a chance event. Then, of course, it was no longer chance when that actually conferred a selective advantage, and then selection could get to work and increase the likelihood of those individuals surviving. Other concepts that if this were an Evo-Devo talk, and I could go on at length about them, we could talk about modularity. It turns out that many of these genes are working together in cooperative modules, like the circuits in a circuit board, to carry out various functions. So there's this complexity that's built in because they're trying to carry out fairly complex functions that are built up from simpler functions. And again, if you go to Radio Shack, many of you, I'm sure, went through this phase at least once, where you went to the Radio Shack and you just had to build a radio or something. And what do you find? You get all these little simple modules that don't do much. You stack them together and you get function out of it. That's what's going on in evolution. Of course, we were doing it by design. Evolution does it by chance. Multifunctionality is another component. Like I mentioned with the driftwood wall, it doesn't have a specific function. It's not there because it's supposed to make a wall. When we look at things like the receptor tyrosine kinases, they're not there because they have to make a liver. They're there just for a more general function of cell-cell communication. Incremental tinkering is an important one. Once you get this little piece that sort of works, you have to have more changes to increase its ability. Just adding a receptor tyrosine kinase to a single-celled protist doesn't turn it into me. There's a whole bunch of other features that had to evolve gradually over time by tinkering to eventually produce fully fledged multicellular organisms with complicated patterns of communication within them. And another factor, of course, is contingency. We've inherited receptor tyrosine kinases. There's no particular reason why we need an EGF tied to a tyrosine kinase to carry out this function. And as we look at biology, we find many other cell signaling molecules that use other modularities to carry out their function. So in part, this is chance, again, that has established this particular set of molecules in our ancient ancestors, and we still retain them. All of these then, of course, are shaped by functional constraints. Stuff that doesn't work, that interferes with working, gets culled out by natural selection. Okay, so that's one message I want to get across to you is okay, the metaphor is wrong. Complexity doesn't mean it's design. And even though we have complexity, we have other paths to arrive at complexity. But I don't want to leave you with just that because I've just been talking all sciencey stuff at you, right? And some of you won't remember that, and others of you will say, oh, well, that was really boring, I knew that already. Let me just mention some of the things. So one of the things we have to do as communicators is we have to carry out something that gets the message across to people. And there are metaphors out there that are useful, and there are words out there that are useful, and I want to introduce you to a really useful word, one of my favorite words to describe evolution, development in the genome, and that's kipple. Any of you have read Philip K. Dick? You must have. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Yeah, oh, it's a classic. It's the book that was made into the movie Blade Runner and so forth. And Philip K. Dick was crazy, but he came up with all kinds of interesting ideas. And here's this word he came up with. It's called kipple. That what you find is that when you look at natural things, they tend to get very messy over time. He's basically restating laws of thermodynamics here, but kipple's a little catchier than thermodynamics. And so what he's saying is it's like my desk at my office. My desk is accumulating kipple. It's not because gnomes come in and do it. It's because chance, because this lack of intent, the lack of intelligence tends to accumulate these sorts of sloppinesses that can produce a very complicated outcome. So kipple's a word I want more people to use. When you talk about the human genome, for instance, just remember it's 95% kipple. And then one other concept I'll close with, and I'm glad I'll have a little time for questions here. And this is another word that I really like, and it's going to be very much out of character for me because this is a religious word. This is a really useful religious word, and it comes from one of the good religions, however. It comes from Bokononism, which is a creation of the author Kurt Vonnegut. And he came up with this term, granfalloon. If you wish to study a granfalloon, just remove the skin of a toy balloon. Isn't that pretty? What a granfalloon is it's a group of people who outwardly choose or claim to have a shared identity or purpose, but whose mutual association is actually completely meaningless. And he gives the classic, the canonical example of a granfalloon is this one from his book, Cat's Cradle, Hoosiers. Is there anybody from Indiana here? All right. Hey there, Hoosiers. I lived in Indiana for a year. I get to be a semi-honorary Hoosier. You're all people who are in a group. We can categorize you. We could pull all the Hoosiers out of this room and have them stand up here and get their picture taken, all this kind of stuff, and you wouldn't know each other. You really don't have much association with each other, but you do have that linkage. But ultimately, it's a kind of meaningless linkage. I think that's what we're dealing with when we listen to creationists talk about design. Design to a creationist is what a Hoosier is to us. It's a completely artificial label that we've put on a set of phenomena. And we're saying that this links them all together. But they haven't defined design, they haven't given us a methodological process for understanding design. They're just making it up as they go along. So that's the context we have to keep that in. So I've left you with two brand new words, Kipple and Granfalloon, and you'll probably remember those after you remember receptor tyrosine kinase. Thank you, and I'll answer any questions.
When you went to these ID conferences, did you ask any questions?
Oh, yes, I always ask questions at these conferences. It's a lot of fun.
What are their responses typically like?
Well, first of all, they know me. And I can tell you, the Discovery Institute doesn't like me for some reason. They really resent me. I've done various things. Usually at these things, they're putting up this pretense of science, right? So I usually ask something about the science that they've just told us. For instance, Michael Behe, when he talked about blood clotting pathways, I could just get up there and ask him a few detailed questions about Russ Doolittle's work on the clotting pathways, which have shown that you can remove components of it and the organism is perfectly fine. And he shuts up real fast. One of the most common responses, and I'm sure this will resonate with everyone here, is when I start asking these questions, they don't answer the question, they say, okay, everyone, this is P.Z. Myers, and he is an atheist. And they're done. They've already got the audience on their side, so that's where it usually goes.
I just was wondering if you could say something about, it seems like the lack of good science education in public schools. Do you feel like that has any kind of relationship to the fact that atheists are still such a minority? And can you talk about, of course, you are a college professor, but don't you think it needs to start earlier? And do you think that's really what they're...
Yeah, I sometimes give talks on science education, and I have to admit at all these talks that it's too late by the time they get to me, that I'm a failure that way, and that the real heroes of science education in this country have to be kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade teachers. And I sort of agree with you, but I think that it's a mistake to think that teaching, I don't think teaching elementary school kids about receptor tyrosine kinases would make a single bit of difference.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's not going to do it. That what I would like to see more of is more teaching of critical thinking.
Yeah.
That general skills in skepticism, we don't have to teach them, I've actually told people this, and in my department, and they hate me for this, is that when we talk to the public schools, we should be telling them that they don't need to teach any of their students biology at all, because what happens is that they come to college and we have to unteach them all the crap that they were stuffed full of. And what I would like to see more of in the schools is some basics. I would like more critical thinking. I would like, this is another heresy I commit. I like to tell them that they should be teaching some philosophy, basic philosophy in the high schools. And then the other big one is math. The number one metric for determining whether a student will succeed in the sciences is not how many science classes they took, but whether they've mastered basic calculus. It's like 100%, one-to-one correlation, just perfection, that having students who know their math means they're going to sail through chemistry, they're going to sail through biology, they're going to do a great job.
And the follow-up question is, how can we, it seems like as an atheist, if you try to get involved with school boards or advancing curriculum or whatever, you're instantly looked at with skepticism, you're pushing an atheist agenda or whatever. So is there a, I don't know, under the radar way that we can participate? Do we have to lie? Is dishonesty a prerequisite?
No, and I've experienced this firsthand. I actually offered, I'm active in the DFL in my community, and I actually offered to run for school board, and all my fellow DFLers just look at me in horror. They said, but the voters would look at your website, and I'd be doomed, which is true. I had to admit it. But I think the thing is that what we have to do is constantly hammer. We have to, don't fly under the radar. Don't try to even do that. Show up at your school boards. I go to my school board meetings, and they know I'm an atheist, and I don't try to hide it, and I espouse these scientific, materialist, naturalistic views, but you discover that there are quite a few very rational Christians, too, who once somebody's articulated the objections, are willing to say, yeah, you know, that makes sense, and join in. So yeah, shout out more. That's what I say.
Thank you.
Hi. My question is to you, because I've been running into a lot of my question is with the progression of science and evidence for things, I've ran across a lot of Christians, presumably Christians, or other religious people that have become more rational and a little bit more secular. And for instance, a big one is evolution. They'll accept the fact that because of the evidence now and the more we keep progressing, that everything else evolved but humans.
Right.
So, I mean, I get that now that I've been, I've actually been getting more of those kind of answers than before, where they just like evolution is false and God is the way and
Yeah.
all that. But now they're like, well, everything else evolved, but we didn't though. We didn't come from monkeys or whatever. So
Right.
I was kind of wondering what your thoughts on were that and why maybe they're
Yeah.
they're accepting everything else but us.
Yeah, the person that asked this question is Eugenie Scott when she's here. Talk to her about it, because she'll tell you exactly the same thing, that depending how you word the polls, you get different responses. If you have a general statement about evolution that includes humans, more people reject it than if you say, well, did dogs evolve? They're happy to say that dogs evolved. Well, not all of them, but a larger number of them. So yeah, there's this personal bias that people hate to think that they came from monkeys, which is too bad.
Yeah.
A monkey is a beautiful thing. But anyway, they've just got to, again, we just have to keep hammering on them. However, it's not a matter of simply teaching them science. You know, there's all these wonderful discoveries that keep coming out. You know, if you read Science yesterday, just yesterday they published this big set of articles on Ardipithecus, this brand new specimen that's been discovered, a 4.4 million year old hominin. It's fabulous stuff. They won't be convinced by that. They won't care. There's sort of a philosophical, metaphysical block in their heads that will just sort of try to adapt any
Kind of like
data.
an inferiority complex or something.
Yes, and that's why I say with the little kids, you don't need to teach them that, but teach them critical thinking, teach them how to evaluate the evidence. And of course then what also happens is many of these people who abandon faith over science aren't doing it necessarily because science is so wonderfully attractive. It's because it's reasonable and they present evidence, and all of a sudden they discover that their pastor has been lying to them all these years, and there's a sense of betrayal that leads to that leaving the faith, which is something a little different than actually getting them introduced into science.
All right. Thanks.
Hi. I grew up as an atheist in a small town here in California, and one thing that always struck me reading your blogs, it was so incongruous to have such a high-profile atheist author in the middle of rural Minnesota. I was wondering what the experience, because my experience being just a regular rank-and-file atheist in the middle of nowhere was interesting. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about your experiences as being such a high-profile atheist in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, it's really simple to explain. In my case, it's poor impulse control. Okay, that's all it is I open my mouth and say things. But there's a misconception here. It's that atheists are these urban elites and so forth, and it's not true. They're everywhere. They're all over the place. And I can tell you this from personal testimony that I've talked to many people in my itty-bitty little town, and yes, you're right, I am the village atheist. There's many of them that call me, and it's been this bizarre experience. I get people calling me to get parenting advice, and they ask me all these little things about, how do you deal with that crazy Christian who runs the grocery store? And all this will say, I've been calling myself the atheist rabbi of Morris, Minnesota, because I get all these calls. And one thing I've noticed is, all these different people call me. There's like 20 different people that have called me and talked to me about this. And I say to them, hey, I know 19 other atheists in this town. If we could get together. We could all get together, and you don't have to rely on me. I could introduce you to all these other people. All I got to do is tell them your name, and they stop right there. So, some of them, for instance, own businesses in town, and if it got out, there goes the business. So there's all these people, they're sitting there who don't have an outlet, and they just have to sit there quietly and suck it up. It's really sad that real estate agents can't get tenure. Tenure's a big help here. And that's why, so yeah, you know, I bet you in your little town you weren't the only atheist. You just didn't know it.
Hello.
Hi.
As a lot of graduate and PhD students, eventually we're going to be going into teaching. And the problem that I'm having with a lot of my friends is that they're having to submit their curriculum to get possible interviews and things like that, and they're having to address the question of how are you going to answer creationism in our physical science classes, whether physical anthropology, bioarchaeology, osteology, any of these questions. And so how do you deal with that question when you, like, proposed by the school board?
Tenure. But yeah, no, this is serious, and this is probably where there's a real crisis, because this is one of the things that can get a teacher to lose their job or not get a job in the first place, is being an atheist. When I've talked to prospective teachers about this, what I tell them is it's a fact of life that you're one of those people who's going to have to be fairly quiet about your atheism, and that's very sad. And
I'm not really a quiet person.
yeah, well, okay, then you'll get along. And I tell them what you need to do instead is read my site more often and leave more comments, and that will make up for it. But you're right, it's a serious problem. But what you have to do when you deal with specific topics is you have to stand up for your principles. Now, as a teacher, your job is not to go into the classroom and teach atheism. So I don't think you're hurting yourself when you keep that quiet. But if you're a science teacher, don't accept a job where they're going to expect you to teach lies to little children. Be forthright. Just, teach them science.
Thank you.
Okay, time is short.
I think your observations have been the same as mine, that designers always appeal to logical fallacy and overextended analogy. It sounded like your part of that response, or your response to that, was to ask some targeted questions, as only an evolutionary biologist can, right? Is that a productive approach? Because it seems like the audience that would be useful for isn't in the room when you're asking the questions.
Well, yeah, in my audiences, though, they're there. So that works. And
but when you visit the Discovery Institute lectures,
they would never let me in the door. No. But no, the thing is that many of these creationists and intelligent design creationists are tightly focused on evolution. So they should know this stuff. And I'm not clear whether they're simply malicious or abysmally ignorant, but one or the other, the stuff is there, and they should be interested in hearing what a biologist has to say about it. But yeah, in cases of other audiences, like, if you're running for school board, not running as an atheist, obviously, but you're running for school board on rational policies, then you would talk about something completely different. I think another avenue is, for instance, economics. People understand basic economics. They know things like, you can't spend more than you bring in and so forth. And that's rational thought right there. And that's a way to get at them. Focus on what they're interested
so
in.
you're saying take the approach of appealing to your audience, regardless, typical speaker's tactic.
Yes, target the questions at your audience, but keep it rational at every point.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but maybe we can get one more, if it's a quick one.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to ask your opinion on something.
Oh, this could take hours.
Oh, no. I mean, it's just this one, I guess I discovered this hobbit phos in Flores, and I just want to know your opinion. Do you consider it a separate species, or do you just think it's a Homo sapien with micro?
That's, I've actually read the articles and the books. I'm really interested in that story.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cool. And right now I kind of feel like the evidence is leaning towards saying, yes, they are a separate species. However, this is another attribute of science. What I'm waiting for is more specimens, more research to be done, and whichever way the evidence takes me is the way I'll ultimately go. Okay. I do not have an ideological, mythological commitment to hobbits being
Yeah,
the
I mean, I
species.
saw it on Nat Geo, and it's like, well, you're a biologist, so
yeah,
I
I would just say that at this point, I think the evidence is tilting towards them being a separate species with some very interesting attributes, but we need more work. That's because that's always true in science. We always need more work.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Maybe we can just ask this separately. Okay, fire it off.
I didn't know if you knew about Ray Comfort's most recent show of his intellectual force.
Oh,
They're
the
handing
free
out
giveaway.
Bibles with the introduction.
You haven't been reading my site.
No, I haven't.
I caught you. Yeah, no, I've actually
I mean, do you
put-
think atheists will ever have the organizational capacity or the funding to do something like hand out Bibles with evolutionary introductions or?
but
I
that
mean,
would
that's
be
tongue in cheek, but
yeah, but that would be a book that's 99% wastage. Why would we do that?
waste of paper.
Yeah, I think what we have to do is encourage more groups to work independently. I think the best approach to the Comfort giveaway is for people to give lectures on campus, to talk to people on the street, ask them questions, engage people on the questions, and show that Ray Comfort is a fool.
Yeah.
Okay, there's beer out there.